So the children were lined up in the cafeteria of a Catholic school for lunch. And at the head of the table was a large tray of bread slices. And a nun had posted a sign on the bread tray which read, "Take only one, God is watching." Well, further along in the lunch line, at the other end of the table was a large pile of chocolate chip cookies. And one child whispered to another, "Take all you want. God is watching the bread." Apparently, God is a fan of bread. Who knew? No low-carb diets for the Creator. Excuse my simplistic theology for a moment, not to be taken literally. But if God didn't like bread, God would not have created so many different types of bread. Everything from and I'm not going to pronounce these right, but the Aish Maraha bread in Egypt to the Zwieback bread in Germany. Some of you may be familiar with that. I don't know. But everything in between, A to Z. There are hundreds of different kinds of bread in the world. It is a basic food staple. And of course, bread holds a very prominent place in the biblical writings. From the unleavened bread that the Israelites ate on Passover to the bread that Jesus broke with his disciples, claiming that it was his body. And you remember during his own wilderness wandering, Jesus was tempted, because he was so hungry, to turn stones into bread. But then he was reminded that man does not live by bread alone. One of the interesting things about the Bible is that it will often take something that's very common and ordinary and mundane, like bread, and then elevate it by attributing spiritual qualities to it. So our two readings this morning highlight what I call the spirituality of bread. In the first story from the book of Exodus, we read about a bread-like substance called manna. Now, what's that all about? The Israelites, as you know, they had escaped slavery from Egypt, and now they find themselves in a big desert with little or no food. So they begin to complain to their leader, or both leaders, Aaron and Moses, that as slaves in Egypt, they fared much better than they do now. And so they would prefer to go back to Egypt. Even if they died in Egypt, they would have plenty of food to eat. Who wouldn't want to do that? I mean, have you ever really been hungry? Like really hungry? I know you've been hungry, but few of us in here have missed many meals due to a lack of food. We're talking about real hunger here, that which is experienced these days by nearly 15% of the people who live in developing nations. These are people who are starving every day. I want to pause here just for a moment and make a little bit of a soapbox comment. As Americans, we value, it seems, freedom over everything else. That's sort of our thing, right? Freedom. And yet food is more important than freedom. We need to remember that. Even today, I think some dictatorships around the world survive simply because the people are fed. Food is a first priority because it is an absolute necessity. Freedom is a secondary priority. And I think we should always keep this in mind when we are considering liberating another country from underneath a dictatorship. Now, I'll step off my soapbox now. But according to the book of Exodus, God supplied these stomach-grumbling Israelites with manna in the morning and quail in the evening. If we were dietitians, we might call this carb-protein combination the wilderness wandering diet. It's probably not a highly recommended diet, but that's what they had. So what was the manna? We don't really know. The writer introduces it by claiming that God said to Moses, "I am going to rain bread from heaven for you." And then a few verses later, we discover a few more details about this. In the morning, there was a layer of dew around the camp. And when the layer of dew lifted, There on the surface of the wilderness was a fine, flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. Does that sound yummy? It sounds soggy, does it not? Now, we don't know what the manna was, but we know what the writer was trying to say. Something needed was supplied unexpectedly. Something needed was supplied unexpectedly. In fact, the word manna is often used for anything that is needed and supplied unexpectedly. Have you ever received a monetary gift from someone at just the right time? Have you ever received a kind or encouraging word from someone at the moment it was needed most? Manna from heaven. Now, before you start thinking that the Israelites got a raw deal with soggy bread in the morning, let me share with you something I learned recently from a book titled Think Like a Freak. Now, this book was written by the two authors that have written a couple other books called Freakonomics and Super Freakonomics. Interesting books. It's a good afternoon read if you really just want something fun and light. But they tell this story that in the year 2000, a young, slender Japanese man named Kobayashi entered the Coney Island hot dog eating contest for the first time, and on his very first attempt, he ate 50 hot dogs in 12 minutes, essentially doubling the world record. And then for several years, he annihilated the competition until others figured out his secrets. So how did he eat so many hot dogs? Well, first thing he did was he studied the competition. And he noticed that everyone acted like they were at a backyard barbecue. They would just cram the dogs and the buns into their mouths and then wash it down with water. Kobayashi decided there had to be a better strategy. And so he noticed, among other things, that the hot dog itself can be chewed much easier without the bread. And so he separated the dogs and the buns because there was no rule against that. He took the dogs out of the buns and he would eat the dogs while at the same time soaking the buns in water and vinegar, which made the buns much easier to chew and swallow. Kobayashi made a lot of money on soggy bread. For him, a financially struggling college student, it was manna from heaven. Never underestimate soggy hot dog buns. So soggy bread of any kind, it sounds a little gross when you just say it, right? But have you ever had an Italian beef sandwich dipped in the au jus sauce, or a French dipped roast beef sandwich dipped in the sauce? Have you ever just had a plate full of gravy left over after breakfast and decided to sop it up with your bread, or a bowl of beans, right? And you sop up the bean juice with the bread? Soggy bread can be a heavenly experience. So let's move on to the next reading. This is found in John 6. Now, today's reading comes right on the heels of the story of the feeding of the 5,000, which, as you remember, featured the following menu items: fish and bread. And there's that protein carb diet once again, right? The people, they know a good thing when they see it or they eat it. And so they go looking for Jesus again, a crowd of people. They even go so far as to getting in their boats and sailing across the Sea of Galilee looking for him, because full stomachs don't stay full for long. When they find Jesus, he quickly understands why they are really there, their true motives. And he says to them, "Very truly, I tell you, you're looking for me not because you saw signs, that is, signs of God's realm, but because you ate your fill of the loaves." In other words, you're missing the point, which is bigger than your stomachs. And so he gives them a little mini lesson. He says, don't work for the food that perishes. Don't go to all that trouble just for some bread. But for the food that endures for eternal life, he says. Now, those are nice words, but I imagine they must have fallen on hollow ears with people who had hollow stomachs. We should never use that passage to tell hungry people, well, you know, all you really need is Jesus. Or, I know you're hungry, but man cannot live by bread alone. That would be cruel. So don't use the Bible that way. Nevertheless, John's gospel is trying to prod us to think beyond our physical stomachs, to think about how we might nourish our spiritual stomachs, because we are spiritual beings, which means that it is possible for us to focus on things other than our material and physical needs. Have any of you ever fasted? Anyone? You don't have to raise your hand. I've tried it a few times. Fasting is considered a spiritual discipline, and yet it's not widely practiced for obvious reasons. People get hungry. But it does directly address the human need to transcend our physical need for bread and consider our spiritual need for the bread of life. And John's Jesus reflects this need when he says, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry or thirsty. A couple interesting stories. And what we find in both the manna in the Exodus story and the bread of life in John's gospel is this notion that something needed is received unexpectedly. None of us can claim that that's always true. We don't always get what we need or want, right? And yet I don't think that many of us would be here today if our spiritual needs were not being met on some level. But both stories have something else in common. Soggy bread. Now we understand the sogginess of the manna, right, in the book of Exodus. But where do we find soggy bread in John's story? The answer is in Jesus himself. The late Marcus Borg refers to Jesus as a God-intoxicated man. This is Borg's way of saying that Jesus was Spirit-filled. I don't know if that's a double entendre or not. Spirit-filled. He was God-intoxicated. Jesus, the bread of life, was soggy. He was drenched in the Spirit. He spent so much time swimming in the living water that he started to resemble, spiritually speaking, a big prune. Now, as you know, this has been a pretty wet summer, right? We have received so much rain that the ground is too saturated to soak up anymore. And so now when it rains, we get flash floods and exasperated farmers. All the rain may be a nuisance in a physical way, but sogginess is a great metaphor for the God-soaked life. Think about this. As Christians, we begin our journeys how? With a ritual bath called baptism. And although most of us are not, or were not fully immersed in the water, that's not really our tradition, I think baptism does serve as a wonderful sign about life in the Spirit. As Christ followers, we should be bathed in the waters of baptism, soaked in Scripture, and saturated in the Spirit. Finally, after dwelling on this theme for a few days, I've decided maybe it's time for us to inaugurate a new Christian symbol, soggy bread. Think about that for a Christian symbol. We've got the cross and we've got the dove and we've got all these symbols. Why not soggy bread? Think about it. Soggy bread is a symbol of God's grace, dripping in unconditional love. Soggy bread represents the peace of God, which spills over in terms of our ability to comprehend it. Soggy bread is served alongside the overflowing cup of goodness and mercy that the writer of Psalm 23 says follows us all the days of our lives. Soggy bread points to the justice that rolls down like waters an ever-flowing stream of righteousness. Soggy bread is a picture of those who have been anointed, drenched in the Spirit, to bring good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of God's favor. Soggy bread is a metaphor for the fullness of God, filled to overflowing, soaked to saturation. Let us partake of the soggy bread.